Imagine it's November 1923. You're a retired school teacher in Berlin. You spent 41 years in a classroom. You taught 3 generations of children to read. You contributed diligently to your pension. You paid your taxes. You followed every rule. And now you're standing in a bread line at 5 in the morning because the pension check that arrived yesterday cannot buy a single loaf today. The check wasn't small. It was for 4.2 trillion marks. That's not a typo. 4.2 trillion marks. And it was worth less than the paper it was printed on. Across the city, a factory worker who owes money on his apartment is watching the same collapse. But something strange is happening to him. His debt, which once represented 15 years of wages, is now payable with 2 weeks of work. The very same monetary annihilation that destroyed you has erased his burden entirely. 1 month later, your neighbor who runs a small import business is selling American canned goods at a 7,000% markup. He takes payment in Swiss francs only. He is wealthier now than at any point in his life. Same city, same collapse, radically different outcomes. This is not a story about luck. It is not a story about intelligence. And it is certainly not a story about who worked harder. This is a story about position. Where you were standing when the system broke determined everything. And here's what most people never understand until it's too late. You could have predicted who would be destroyed and who would survive before a single domino fell. Because economic collapses don't distribute pain randomly. They distribute pain structurally. There are patterns, and they repeat. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly who loses everything in a collapse. Not theoretically, historically, using documented cases from Weimar Germany, Argentina, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and the Soviet Union. We'll examine 4 categories of people who are structurally positioned to lose. And we'll examine the one category that consistently survives. This isn't opinion. It's forensic analysis of what actually happened to real people when systems failed. Once you see these patterns, you cannot unsee them. Type 1. The prudent saver. The prudent saver is perhaps the cruelest victim of economic collapse. Cruel because they did everything right. They worked. They spent less than they earned. They avoided debt. They accumulated savings in the currency of their country, in the banks of their country, following the advice of their country's financial institutions. And they are the first to be annihilated. To understand why, you need to understand one mechanism that operates in almost every severe economic crisis: the transfer of wealth from savers to debtors through currency destruction. In 1921, Germany owed war reparations it could not pay. The government's response was to print money, continuously. By November 1923, the exchange rate that had been 4.2 marks to $1 in 1914 had become 4.2 trillion marks to $1. If you had saved 100,000 marks in 1914, enough to buy a house, by 1923, you could not buy a newspaper with it. But here's the part most people miss. The government didn't steal that purchasing power. It transferred it. The wealth didn't disappear. It moved to debtors, to the government itself, which owed its own citizens, to anyone holding hard assets. The prudent saver lost everything not because they made a mistake, but because the system was designed so that their loss would be someone else's gain. Now consider Argentina, December 2001. The government froze all bank accounts. It was called the Corralito. Overnight, savers who had deposited US dollars in Argentine banks discovered those dollars had been converted to pesos at a forced rate. Then the peso devalued by 75%. People who had saved 100,000 US dollars found themselves holding the equivalent of $25,000. And they couldn't even access that because the accounts were frozen. They had followed every rule, and they lost everything. In Zimbabwe, 2008, the annual inflation rate reached 89.7 sextillion%. Prices doubled every 24.7 hours. A person who saved enough money to retire on Monday was impoverished by Wednesday. The pattern is always the same. Savers accumulate units of currency. The government, facing unpayable obligations, destroys the unit of measurement. The saver's lifetime of labor evaporates. This is not accidental. This is the mechanism. Governments cannot default on their own currency. They can only dilute it. And dilution is a selective tax on those who hold the currency, which is to say, a tax on savers. Your savings in any fiat currency are only as stable as the fiscal discipline of the government that issues it. And history suggests that fiscal discipline is the first casualty of any serious crisis. Type 2, the fixed income professional. The second category is the fixed income professional. This includes teachers, civil servants, pensioners, mid-level corporate employees, doctors in public health systems, and most of the traditional middle class. These are people who earn a salary set by contract or by law. Their income adjusts slowly, if at all, to changing conditions. In a collapse, they face a brutal asymmetry. Their expenses adjust instantly to new prices, but their income does not. Consider what happened in Russia after the Soviet collapse. In January 1992, the Russian government liberalized prices overnight. By year's end, consumer prices had increased by 2,500%. The ruble fell by over 99% against the dollar. Doctors and engineers, who had been respected members of Soviet society, found their salaries worthless. Many took second and third jobs just to survive. A professor might spend his morning teaching physics and his afternoon selling cigarettes from a folding table. By 1993, Russia's GDP had fallen by more than 40% from its 1989 level. Male life expectancy dropped by 6 years in a single decade, one of the sharpest peacetime declines in modern history. These were not lazy people. These were professionals who had spent decades acquiring credentials that suddenly meant nothing because the system that credentialed them had collapsed. The same pattern emerged in Venezuela. Doctors in the public health system were earning the equivalent of $6 to $10 per month by 2018, not per day, per month. A neurosurgeon with 20 years of training could not afford to eat properly. Venezuela lost an estimated 22,000 physicians between 2012 and 2018. Those who remained worked in hospitals without medicine, without electricity, without running water. The mechanism here is straightforward. Professional status is a social agreement. You invest years in training. In return, society pays you a stable income that reflects that investment. But this agreement depends on two conditions. The currency must hold its value, and the institutions that employ you must remain solvent. When either condition fails, professional status becomes a liability. You cannot quickly retrain. Your skills are specialized for a system that no longer functions. You're trapped between worthless earnings and inflexible obligations. The fixed income professional is destroyed by the very stability they sought. Type 3. The asset holder in the wrong asset. The third category is more subtle. These are people who understood they should hold assets rather than currency. They owned property, stocks, or businesses, and they still lost everything. Because not all assets are equal in a collapse. Some assets become traps. First, real estate in the wrong jurisdiction. In Argentina, during the 2001 crisis, real estate prices collapsed by 50 to 70% in dollar terms. If you owned an apartment outright, you still owned it. But if you needed to sell, you found no buyers with dollars. If you rented it out, your tenants paid in worthless pesos. And here's the cruel part. The government implemented emergency rental laws that prevented eviction and froze rent prices. Landlords were legally required to accept worthless pesos from tenants they couldn't remove. Property is an asset, but property is immovable. It is subject to the laws of wherever it sits. And governments in crisis confiscate value from property owners through rent controls, capital controls, wealth taxes, or outright seizure. Second, stocks in domestic companies. In Zimbabwe, the stock market technically rose during hyperinflation. The Zimbabwe Industrial Index increased by millions of percent between 2007 and 2008. But this was an illusion. In real terms, adjusted for inflation, investors lost catastrophically. More importantly, many companies ceased operations entirely. Supply chains collapsed. The stocks became claims on nothing. Third, assets denominated in the failing currency. Many prudent Argentines purchased peso-denominated bonds with dollar adjustment clauses. They believed they were protected. When the crisis hit, the government forcibly converted these instruments to pesos at the official rate before the devaluation. The protection was nullified by decree. This is the trap of the wrong asset. You can own property, but if it's in the wrong jurisdiction, you can be taxed or frozen out of your wealth. You can own stocks, but if they are in domestic companies dependent on a functioning system, they become worthless when the system fails. You can own bonds, but if they're subject to the laws of a desperate government, those laws will be rewritten to your disadvantage. The asset holder in the wrong asset failed because they didn't understand that all assets are embedded in political and legal systems, and those systems fail first. Type 4. The optimist. The fourth category may be the most common and the most tragic, the optimist. The optimist is not ignorant. They may be highly educated. They may even understand the mechanisms we've discussed. But they believe, fundamentally, that things will not get that bad. They believe the system will correct. They believe someone is in charge. And so they wait. They wait too long to move assets abroad. They wait too long to diversify currencies. They wait too long to leave. And then the window closes. In every collapse, there is a period before the acute phase when informed people exit. They move capital. They establish foreign residency. They do this quietly, often at apparent cost, because the system still seems functional. This period can last months or years. Then, quite suddenly, the window closes. In Argentina, capital controls appeared overnight in December 2001. One day, you could wire money abroad. The next day, you could not. In Venezuela, the bolivar was increasingly difficult to exchange for dollars starting around 2012. By 2018, moving money out was nearly impossible for ordinary citizens. In Cyprus, in 2013, banks were closed for 2 weeks. When they reopened, depositors above 100,000 euros found a portion of their funds seized. In each case, optimists believed there would be more time. They were wrong. Consider the Soviet Union. In 1985, the USSR was a superpower with the world's largest army and apparent permanence. Professors, generals, and diplomats built careers on the assumption that the Soviet system would outlast them. By 1991, it was gone. Career Party members found their pensions worthless. Generals found their commands dissolved. An entire nation dissolved in less time than a university degree takes to complete. The optimists in 1985 were not stupid. They simply could not imagine discontinuity. The optimist fails not from lack of information, but from a psychological incapacity to act on uncomfortable information. This is perhaps the most important lesson. The threat is not ignorance. The threat is normalcy bias. Why does any of this happen? Economic collapses are not random. They are the predictable results of irreversible constraints. A government spends more than it collects in taxes. To cover the difference, it borrows. The borrowing creates obligations. The obligations compound with interest. Eventually, the obligations exceed the capacity to pay. At this point, there are only three options. 1. Default openly, crashing the financial system immediately. 2. Impose severe austerity so deep that the population revolts. 3. Print money to meet obligations, transferring the cost invisibly through inflation. Historically, option 3 is chosen almost universally. It is chosen because it is the only option that does not require explicit consent. Debasing the currency can be done quietly, incrementally, and blamed on external forces. The constraint is debt mathematics. When debt grows faster than the economy, you are on a path that ends in one of those three outcomes. There is no fourth option. There is no magic solution. Those who understand this see the collapse before it arrives. Not because they have supernatural insight, but because they can read a balance sheet. The one who doesn't lose everything. We have examined 4 categories of collapse victims. Each failed for a specific structural reason, but there is a 5th category, the one who survives. Let me describe them not by what they believe, but by how they are positioned. The survivor holds assets across multiple jurisdictions, not because they distrust any particular government, but because they understand that all governments face the same constraints and may respond the same way. In the lead-up to Argentina's collapse, wealthy Argentines held accounts in Miami, Montevideo, and Switzerland. When the Corralito froze domestic accounts, they had access to foreign liquidity. The survivor holds assets in forms that cannot be easily confiscated, devalued, or taxed by a single authority. This includes physical assets like precious metals. It includes foreign real estate. It includes businesses with international revenue streams. The survivor maintains skills that are valuable, independent of credential systems. In the Soviet collapse, doctors who could only practice in Soviet hospitals were devastated. But doctors who had language skills and international connections rebuilt their lives abroad. In Venezuela, programmers who worked for foreign clients in dollars maintained their standard of living while their neighbors starved. The survivor has optionality, the ability to change circumstances without catastrophic loss. They can leave a country without abandoning all wealth. They can access currency from multiple sources. Their assets are not all dependent on a single system functioning. This is not about being rich. Some very wealthy people lost everything because their wealth was entirely domestic. Some middle-class people preserved their standard of living because they had diversified early. It is about understanding a principle. Single points of failure are fatal in systemic crises. In Germany in 1922, a minor factory owner began converting his marks into Swiss francs every month. It was expensive. His friends thought him paranoid, but he continued systematically. By late 1923, he had accumulated enough Swiss francs to purchase distressed assets at pennies on the dollar. By 1925, he owned 3 factories. He was not a genius. He simply understood that a currency backed by a government that couldn't pay its debts was a depreciating asset. And he acted on that understanding before it was obvious. The survivor's advantage is not intelligence. It is willingness to act on information that others possess but refuse to accept. If all this is documented history, why do most people not act on it? The first barrier is normalcy bias, the assumption that tomorrow will resemble today. The second is social pressure. Preparing for collapse is stigmatized as paranoid or unpatriotic. The third is cost. Diversification has friction. Moving money abroad has fees. These costs feel real and immediate. The benefits feel abstract. The fourth is cognitive dissonance. If you truly accepted that your country's financial system might collapse, you would have to change your behavior dramatically. Most people prefer to reject the premise. These barriers explain why most people who could prepare do not prepare. The population of Argentina in 2001 was 37 million. The number who had meaningfully diversified abroad was perhaps a few 100,000. The rest faced the crisis unprotected. Human psychology does not change, and so the pattern repeats. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial or investment advice. What you do with this information is your responsibility. Let us return to Berlin, 1923. The retired schoolteacher is now destitute. Her pension is worthless. She followed every rule and lost everything. Across the city, a man who understood currency mathematics is purchasing her apartment building for a handful of Swiss francs. Same city, same collapse, radically different outcomes. This is not a story about fairness. Economic collapses are structural events with structural outcomes. The teacher's position determined her fate. The buyer's position determined his. Neither chose their outcome in the moment of crisis. Both chose it in the years before, through actions taken or not taken, through warnings heeded or ignored. The question is, which of the 5 types are you? The saver, the professional, the asset holder in the wrong asset, the optimist, or the one who survives? Your position is not fixed. It can be changed, but it cannot be changed quickly. And it cannot be changed after the window closes. The pattern is already in motion. It has been in motion since the first currency was debased, since the first government failed to pay its debts, since the first population watched their savings evaporate and wondered why no one warned them. The warning is in the history books. The only question is whether you will read it. This channel exists to autopsy systems before they claim new victims, to provide the analysis that most sources will not. If you found this valuable, consider subscribing, not for entertainment, for preparation. History doesn't wait for permission, and neither does collapse.